a lot of these figures point to, the idea of Boston Commons or magisterial Reformation Europe, and that's where things get really interesting. And, I was up in Boston a few years ago, and I wanted to go see a few different sites. And this is sort of the idea of where we see this idea of Christian nationalism in its early form in the United States of America. So it wasn't just an issue of we're having individuals enforce the idea of thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not kill, sort of sometimes the second table of the law in that regard of the 10 commandments, but also the first table of the law. And it gets really interesting as it relates to like Sabbath laws. Can you really, in many respects, punish somebody for not following the Sabbath? So in Boston, they had this really interesting case of this with a woman named Mary Dyer. She was brought over to the United States and she was a Puritan. She came to Boston as a Puritan, but over the years, she would travel back and forth between the United States and England. And during one of those trips, she converted to the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. And the way that they handled the situation is that during this particular time, she had a miscarriage. The Puritans said things like, the reason you had a miscarriage is because you gave up the Puritan vision of the Christian life and God was bringing punishment upon you. And she started to have different Quaker meetings and she would participate in some of those. And what ultimately happened is they said, if you're not going to go along with our understanding of church and state in this regard, we're going to punish you. And you know how they punished her? They hung her in Boston Commons. So when you're standing in front of the State House, there are two statues. You got John F. Kennedy Jr. and you have Mary Dyer, who's a living example of what happens when we're doing much more than just enforcing morality in the social order. They're actually enforcing a particular understanding of Christianity or religion broadly defined in this regard. We say that just because it's very important to the idea of religious freedom in the United States. So then it raises a whole litany of questions. So if I'm not part of whatever the group that's in charge, can I be killed for these kinds of things? And the reality is Mary Dyer, is an example of, yes, this has happened. And when these guys keep pointing back to this type of religious order that's put in place, you go, well, where am I supposed to live if I disagree with them? How am I supposed to engage with somebody that disagrees with them? And what's interesting is that when you look at the history of this kind of movement, you find there's really not much tolerance for people who have any religious disagreements. Second example, you have an individual named Fritz Erba. Fritz Erba was a lesser known Baptist. And what happened to him is that in the midst of living his life and holding his convictions and his ministry that was taking place, he differed with those who affirmed paedobaptism, infant baptism. And he was put into a prison, buried underground in that regard. And eventually they punished him like they did many other Baptists by saying, oh, you want immersion? We'll give you immersion. And we're not going to bring you out of the water. And they were killed in this regard. That's the fear that a lot of people have with this. Because again, the idea that they're trying to enact is not the idea of religious freedom. The role of the government following the Westminster Confession in this regard is to suppress heresy. Well, what does that look like? Just denying the deity of Christ? Denying the resurrection of Christ? When the long history of this has shown over and over again in sacralist Rome and in Europe in this regard is that if you differ with them, you pay for it with your life. And that's what makes this conversation such a big deal, because they say they're not going to do it, but you go read their literature, they want to have blasphemy laws again.